He uses whatever means necessary, sparing no expense or effort to exterminate all goblins.
As mother, abiding in mercy, let me repair her upon
If it isn't goblins, then I don't care.
going with you. I just can't leave you alone.
This is a story of a man that kills only goblins, whose wish is to become an adventurer. Goblin Slayer. He does not let anyone roll the dice.
Alright, where the fuck do I begin with this? If you're tired of the same old trapped in an MMO, trapped in a fantasy world, trapped in a world where you have to strip elves to get anywhere, then Goblin Slayer gives you a different side of the typical fantasy light novel, a more mundane side. Of course, this is deliberate, as the story shirks off the heroic tales and enchanted swords to tell the story of one extremely competent man against a world of goblins. Originally started as a web novel by Kumo Kagyu, Goblin Slayer was eventually rewritten into a slightly more professional light novel, with illustrations by Noboru Kanasuki. It's been adapted into a manga which has gained some cult popularity, and apparently that was enough to get the light novels translated and officially brought over to the West, because we live in an age where everything remotely Japanese is licensed and translated for us within a week. So, with millions of other fantasy light novels out there, what makes Goblin Slayer stand out? Well, I guess that's what I made this video about. Let's start with Volume 1. My first expectation was that this was going to be generic light novel trash. From the light novels that I've read, there's a very formulaic setup. The sort of average or normal guy paired up with a special girl. You have the average merchant paired up with a wolf goddess. You have the average mercenary paired up with one of the whispered girls. An average brother paired up with a popular otaku model sister, who might as well be mythical. An average high schooler paired up with a literal goddess. An average otaku paired up with a literal goddess. Now, I'm not trying to say that these are in any way carbon copies of each other, because each one has a different premise and takes it in a different direction. What I am pointing out is that a good portion begin with this boy meets girl premise, and then continue on with a will they or won't they plot, until eventually either they do or they do and they're brother and sister and it's weird. Goblin Slayer is in no way an exception. The front cover is a carbon copy of every other light novel, but peel back that front cover and you get your first hint at what Goblin Slayer has in store for its readers. The slightly more worried look on the female lead's face is an indicator to the slightly atypical light novel story that Goblin Slayer is setting up. Because while it still falls into some of the same light novel traps, Goblin Slayer is not your average light novel. First of all, the characters are named after their role in the story. So we have Goblin Slayer, Priestess, Elf Archer, Dwarf Shaman, Lizard Priest, Guild Girl, Cowgirl, get it, to name a few. And if that sounds awkward and clunky, that's because it is. But I went into the story expecting to forget every single character's name immediately. So this quick character recognition actually worked in the story's favor at the expense of its prose. Being a light novel, the reading level is that of a young adult. But there's certain things in Goblin Slayer that you wouldn't find in, say, The Hunger Games. Notably, there's a horrific amount of goblin rape. There is no rape scene in Goblin Slayer. Usually we just see the aftermath, and whenever it's brought up, it's not fetishized, and it's treated as a horribly brutal thing. But let's just say that when you've watched a movie called Rape Zombies, anything will come off as subtle in comparison. As far as the narrative is concerned, the book is a collection of short stories centered around the title character, and boy does this guy know how to start a story off right. The first chapter focuses on the priestess, who teams up with a team of adventurers to attack a goblin nest. The party is full of cliche light novel characters, including like the Megane witch magic user, the fucking boy-girl love romance thing. All these characters die brutally within the first chapter. Priestess is saved at the last minute by Goblin Slayer, who then mercy kills the party's witch. Right away, Goblin Slayer sets himself apart from other light novel protagonists. He's practical, not overpowered. Competent, not completely useless. It clearly comes from a writer who's tired of many of the medium's cliches. However, the true test would be the second chapter. And the second chapter worried me because it was titled Cowgirl. Get it? And featured just about the type of character designs you would expect from a girl called Cowgirl. Get it? Once again, I was pleasantly surprised. This chapter is mostly used to characterize Goblin Slayer through the eyes of his childhood friend, who happens to be extremely busty. I guess that's an added bonus. While this chapter is fine, it does raise my major complaint against the series. Now, Goblin Slayer is a fantasy adventure book first and foremost, but it does have a harem. Goblin Slayer is not a harem light novel, but it does feature harem elements to it. Almost every female in the story is enamored by Goblin Slayer to some degree, some more than others. Comes off as kind of self-insertish. However, this is an annoying but small part of the story. Goblin Slayer has a very good reason to be completely dense about the affections girls give him, and the only one he shows any romantic inclination to is the priestess. The character of Goblin Slayer is what makes this book. He is a complete subversion of the light novel fantasy protagonist, and his lack of social awareness can actually make for some pretty funny scenes. Not only that, but he's a hyper-competent protagonist. He's very well trained at what he does, and what he does is slay goblins. However, outside of that, he's next to completely useless. Volume 2 gives us more of the same while trimming down a few of the weaker elements. Guild Girl and Cowgirl, get it? Are pretty much gone from this volume, veering away from the harem almost entirely and heading more towards just a plain adventure. While there's obviously something of a love triangle being set up between Priestess, Elf, and the Slayer, the focus is really just on Priestess, despite the Elf girl being on the cover. While Volume 1 was a bunch of mini-adventures strapped together, Volume 2 is a completely continuous adventure. It focuses on the group slaying goblins underneath the city. If that sounds like Volume 1, but in a new location, it basically is. It's more of the same, which means if you liked the first one, you'll probably enjoy this, and if you felt like the premise was already running thin by the end of the first volume, you won't get much out of this. But Volume 2 does give us a little twist, and also the best girl, no debating. The Sword Maiden is probably the most interesting and developed character next to the Goblin Slayer himself. She's a former legendary hero who hires the Goblin Slayer to eradicate goblins under her city, but what makes her so interesting is that she's the only other character who's as damaged as Goblin Slayer. And in a cast of fantasy cutouts, that stands out. As far as the rest of the cast go, none of them are outright annoying, but the elf and the dwarf are cut out of basically every single fantasy book you've ever read. While they do some funny stuff with it, there's absolutely nothing new with a elf and dwarf bickering with each other. The lizard priest is a bit of an oddball, but he doesn't really have that much development or screen time. Of the cast, the only three that I really felt were developed and stood out were the priestess, Goblin Slayer, and the Sword Maiden. But that's not to say I didn't enjoy reading the other characters, as their interaction with Goblin Slayer is part of what makes this book really fun to read. They may be stereotypes, but they're interacting with someone who is the polar opposite. Sometime during the writing of Volume 2, a manga adaptation was announced. This is probably the version most people are familiar with, because manga is one of the most easily pirated things on the planet. At the time of this video, the manga has almost adapted the first light novel entirely, and will most likely be moving on to the second any day now. The manga, by virtue of its medium, is more graphic than the novels, where the novels could get away with briefly glossing over the rape scenes in a sentence. The manga does not have that luxury, and does not mind that at all. As much as I hate to say it, There's somebody depraved fapping to Goblin Slayer out there. But as far as an adaptation goes, it's pretty faithful. A few details are removed just due to time, and some scenes are merged with others, but you're more or less getting the same experience, just with really pretty pictures. If you're on the fence about picking up the light novels, it might actually benefit you to check out the manga first. That way you at least know what you're getting into. Of course, if you want to be an elitist hipster like me, you'll start with the source material. Fucking secondaries! What Goblin Slayer reminded me of was a little show called Konosuba. Konosuba knew how to parody the fantasy elements fairly well, but when it came to the light novel elements, the show basically played it straight with waifu baiting, fan service, and all of that shit. Goblin Slayer is also guilty of this to a degree, but the focus is much heavier on subverting the fantasy tropes than setting up waifus. So, would I say Goblin Slayer is better than Konosuba? Yes. Not that either are bad, calm the fuck down. I think the easiest way to describe Goblin Slayer to a newcomer is if Konosuba adapted the troll arc from Berserk. What Goblin Slayer is good at is focusing on the little events. The whole story is a side story to millions of other adventures, and that at least makes it stand out. Demon lords are defeated off-screen and mentioned in barely a sentence, while Goblin Slayer continues to methodically hunt down his prey. He's an anti-hero in the sense that the story goes out of its way to downplay all of his accomplishments, even starting off with a little verse that says that he's not going to be remembered or do anything important in any way. It's setting our hero up for failure. So, while Goblin Slayer may stick a little too close to formula in some regards, the main character and the setting more than make up for that. With a recent audio drama announced, it seems like this will only be a matter of time for this to get an anime. I'd definitely be interested in one, as long as it doesn't have the team behind the Berserk anime.
I'm not saying the word. I'm just kidding.